Tonight, we explore the fascinating world of historical figures whose stories were made up later. From ancient rulers to medieval heroes, from revolutionary icons to religious saints, history is filled with people whose real lives became buried under layers of myth, legend, and deliberate fabrication. As you settle in for rest, let us journey through time and discover the truth behind the tales. The legend of King Arthur stands as one of the most enduring myths in Western civilization. Tales of Camelot, the Knights of the Round Table, Excalibur, and the quest for the Holy Grail have captivated imaginations for over 1,000 years. Yet the historical Arthur, if he existed at all, bears almost no resemblance to the legendary king we know today. The earliest possible reference to a historical Arthur comes from the late 5th or early 6th century, a tumultuous period following the Roman withdrawal from Britain. This was an era of chaos, with various British kingdoms fighting against Saxon invaders from across the North Sea. If Arthur existed, he was likely a Romano-British war leader, possibly a former Roman cavalry officer who led successful battles against the Saxons. The first written mention appears in a 9th century Welsh text called the Historia Brittonum, compiled by a monk named Nennius. This work lists 12 battles fought by Arthur, culminating in the Battle of Badon Hill, where he supposedly killed 960 men single-handedly. Already we see the embellishment beginning, but Arthur as we know him truly emerged centuries later. Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, written around 1136, transformed Arthur from a possible war leader into a mighty king who conquered much of Europe. Geoffrey gave us Merlin the Wizard, though he borrowed this character from earlier Welsh poetry. He gave us Arthur's magical sword, his court at Camelot, and his eventual betrayal and death. Geoffrey claimed to be translating from an ancient British book, but most scholars believe he largely invented his account. He was writing at a time when the Norman rulers of England needed historical legitimacy, and an ancient British king who had ruled a vast empire served their purposes well. The French romances of the 12th and 13th centuries added even more layers. Chrétien de Troyes introduced Lancelot, the greatest of Arthur's knights, who never appeared in any earlier sources. He created the concept of courtly love and made the quest for the Holy Grail central to Arthurian legend. Other French writers added Galahad, refined the character of Guinevere, and developed the tragic love triangle that would doom Camelot. The Round Table itself was a medieval addition, symbolizing the equality of Arthur's knights. Excalibur evolved from earlier Welsh stories of magical swords, but the famous scene of Arthur pulling a sword from a stone appears to be a late medieval invention, possibly inspired by Italian legends of Saint Galgano. Later English writers like Thomas Malory, in his 15th century work, Le Morte d'Arthur, compiled and expanded these French romances. Malory gave us the comprehensive Arthurian narrative that would influence all subsequent versions. His work, printed by William Caxton in 1485, became the definitive medieval telling of the legend. The truth is that if Arthur existed, he lived in a dark age, poorly documented by written records. Archaeological evidence from the period shows a Britain fragmented into competing kingdoms, with no sign of a unified realm or a mighty capital like Camelot. The battles attributed to Arthur may have been fought by multiple leaders over many decades, their achievements combined into one heroic figure. Some scholars suggest Arthur may have been based on a real person whose fame grew through oral tradition. Others believe he was entirely mythical from the start, perhaps derived from earlier Celtic gods or heroes. The name Arthur itself may come from the Roman name Artorius, or from a Celtic word meaning bear. What we can say with certainty is that the Arthur of legend, the noble king who ruled from Camelot with his wise counsellor Merlin and his brave knights, is a medieval creation. The Round Table, the quest for the Grail, the tragic love story, the magical sword. All of these elements were added centuries after any historical Arthur might have lived. The legend served many purposes for those who developed it. For medieval nobility, it provided a model of chivalric virtue and courtly love. For the English monarchy, it offered a connection to a glorious pre-Saxon past. For the Church, the Grail quest became a spiritual allegory. Each generation reshaped Arthur to reflect their own values and needs. Even the idea of Arthur as the once and future king who will return in Britain's hour of greatest need is a later addition to the legend. This messianic element appears to have developed during the medieval period, perhaps influenced by prophecies attributed to Merlin in Geoffrey of Monmouth's work. The power of the Arthurian legend lies not in its historical accuracy, but in its mythic resonance. It speaks to universal themes of heroism, loyalty, betrayal, and the tragic impossibility of creating a perfect society. The story of Camelot has been retold countless times, adapted to every era and medium, from medieval romance to modern fantasy novels and films. Yet, as we drift towards sleep, we can reflect on how a possible Dark Age war leader, or perhaps merely a name in an old poem, became the greatest king in British legend. The real Arthur, if he existed, would likely not recognize himself in the tales told about him. His story reminds us that history and myth often intertwine so thoroughly that separating them becomes impossible. William Tell, the Swiss hero who never was. The story of William Tell has become synonymous with Swiss independence and resistance to tyranny. The legendary archer who shot an apple off his son's head rather than bow to an Austrian overlord represents the spirit of Swiss freedom. Yet William Tell, as a historical figure, almost certainly never existed. According to the legend, in the early 14th century, an Austrian bailiff named Hermann Gessler ruled over the Swiss canton of Uri with cruel authority. He placed his hat atop a pole in the town square of Altdorf and commanded all who passed to bow before it as a sign of respect for Austrian authority. William Tell, a skilled hunter and marksman, refused to bow. As punishment, Gessler ordered Tell to shoot an apple off his own son's head with a crossbow. If Tell succeeded, both would go free. If he failed, both would die. Tell took 2 bolts from his quiver, loaded one into his crossbow, and from a great distance split the apple without harming his son. When Gessler asked about the second bolt, Tell replied that if the first had killed his son, the second would have been for Gessler. Enraged, Gessler had Tell arrested and planned to imprison him for life. During transport across Lake Lucerne, a storm arose. The soldiers freed Tell to help steer the boat, as he knew the lake well. Tell steered the boat near the shore, then leaped to freedom onto a rocky ledge now known as Tell's Chapel. Later, Tell ambushed and killed Gessler, an act that supposedly sparked the Swiss rebellion against Austrian rule. This rebellion led to the formation of the Swiss Confederation and the country's independence. It is a stirring tale of courage, skill, and the triumph of liberty over oppression. The only problem is that no contemporary evidence supports any part of it. The earliest written account of William Tell appears in the White Book of Saanen, compiled around 1470, more than a century and a half after the events supposedly occurred. This chronicle was written to record the founding of the Swiss Confederation, and the Tell story appears alongside other origin myths. No documents from the 14th century mention Tell, Gessler, or the apple shooting incident. The Swiss Confederation actually formed through a series of alliances and conflicts spanning decades, not through a single act of rebellion. The founding document, the Federal Charter of 1291, makes no mention of William Tell. Records from the period discuss various local leaders and their conflicts with Austrian authority, but Tell's name never appears. Historians have noted that the apple shooting story appears in much earlier sources from other cultures. The Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus recorded a nearly identical tale about a Danish archer named Palnatoke in the 12th century. An archer impresses a king with his skill. The king orders him to shoot an apple off his son's head. He succeeds using one of 2 arrows, and he admits the second arrow was meant for the king if the first had killed his son. Similar stories appear in Norse sagas, English ballads, and German legends. The motif of the skilled archer forced to shoot an object off a loved one's head seems to be a widespread folktale that predates the Tell legend by centuries. The character of Hermann Gessler, the tyrannical Austrian bailiff, also appears to be fictional. No historical records document anyone by that name serving as bailiff in Uri during the relevant period. Austrian administrative records from the early 14th century are quite detailed, yet Gessler never appears in them. The geographical details of the legend also raise questions. Altdorf, where Tell supposedly lived and performed his famous shot, was a very small settlement in the early 14th century, not the substantial town depicted in the legend. The distances and locations described in the story often do not match the actual landscape of the region. So why was the story created? And why did it become so important to Swiss identity? The answer lies in the political situation of 15th century Switzerland. The Swiss Confederation was consolidating its independence from the Holy Roman Empire and the Austrian Habsburgs. The Confederation needed unifying myths, heroic founding figures who embodied Swiss values of independence, courage, and resistance to tyranny. The Tell legend provided all of this. It gave the Swiss a clear hero, a villain, and a dramatic origin story. It transformed a complex political and military process spanning decades into a simple, memorable narrative that anyone could understand and embrace. The legend also served to legitimize Swiss independence retroactively. By claiming that their freedom originated in a justified act of resistance against tyrannical rule, the Swiss gave their confederation a moral foundation. Tell became a symbol not just of Swiss independence, but of the universal right to resist oppression. The story gained even greater prominence in the 19th century, during the rise of Romantic nationalism across Europe. Friedrich Schiller's 1804 play Wilhelm Tell became enormously popular, spreading the legend beyond Switzerland. Gioacchino Rossini's 1829 opera Guillaume Tell, with its famous overture, made the story known worldwide. During this period, the Tell legend became deeply embedded in Swiss national consciousness. Monuments were erected, including the famous Tell monument in Altdorf, unveiled in 1895. Tell's chapel on Lake Lucerne became a pilgrimage site. Swiss currency, stamps, and official seals featured Tell's image. Children learned the story in school as historical fact. Some Swiss scholars in the 19th century questioned the legend's historicity, but this was often met with fierce resistance. To question Tell was to question Swiss identity itself. The myth had become so central to Swiss nationalism that historical truth became secondary to cultural meaning. Modern Swiss historians generally acknowledge that William Tell was not a real person. Yet the legend remains important to Swiss culture, now understood as a powerful symbol rather than historical fact. Tell represents Swiss values, courage, independence, and the willingness to resist tyranny, even if the man himself never lived. The Tell legend reminds us how nations create founding myths to forge collective identity. These myths often matter more for what they represent than for their historical accuracy. A possibly invented 14th century archer became more real to generations of Swiss people than many actual historical figures, because the legend spoke to something deeper than mere facts. As we reflect on this, we can consider how the stories we tell about our past shape our understanding of who we are. William Tell never lived, but the idea of William Tell, what he represented and continues to represent, has had a very real impact on history. Sometimes the stories we make up about our past become more influential than the past itself. Pope Joan, the female pope who never reigned. One of the most persistent legends of the medieval period tells of Pope Joan, a woman who supposedly disguised herself as a man, rose through the ranks of the church and became pope in the 9th century. According to the tale, her deception was discovered only when she gave birth during a papal procession through Rome. The story was widely believed for centuries, but Pope Joan almost certainly never existed. The legend typically places Joan's reign between 855 and 857, between the pontificates of Pope Leo IV and Pope Benedict III. The most common version of her story begins in England or Germany, where a young woman of exceptional intelligence fell in love with a wandering scholar. Wishing to follow him, she disguised herself as a man and left her homeland. She travelled to Athens, where she studied philosophy and the sciences, surpassing all her fellow students in knowledge and wisdom. Eventually, she made her way to Rome, where her erudition and eloquence attracted attention. Still disguised as a man, she entered the church and rose steadily through its hierarchy, eventually becoming a cardinal. When Pope Leo IV died in 855, the cardinals elected Joan, whom they knew as John Anglicus, the new pope. Sex 1.0. She served for over 2 years, her true sex unknown to anyone. Some versions of the legend claim she became pregnant by one of her lovers, others that the pregnancy resulted from a liaison before she came to Rome. During a papal procession from St. Peter's Basilica to the Lateran Palace, Joan went into labour. Sex 1.5. She gave birth in the street, either between the Colosseum and the Church of San Clemente, or near the Church of St. Peter in chains, depending on the version. Upon this revelation, she and her child were immediately killed by the shocked crowd, stoned to death or dragged to death through the streets. According to some versions of the legend, subsequent popes avoided the street where Joan gave birth, and a special chair with a hole in the seat was used in papal coronations. Sex 1.0. A cardinal would reach through the hole to verify the new pope's sex, announcing, "He has testicles and they hang well," before the coronation could proceed. The legend also claimed that a statue or marker stood at the spot where Joan gave birth, warning future generations of her deception. Sex 1.5. Medieval pilgrims travelling to Rome reported seeing this marker, though descriptions of it varied widely. The story was first recorded in the 13th century, over 400 years after Joan supposedly lived. Sex 1.0. A chronicle written by a Dominican friar named Jean de Mailly around 1255 contains one of the earliest versions. Another Dominican, Stephen de Bourbon, 13th century, over 400 years after Joan supposedly lived. Sex 1.0. A chronicle written by a Dominican friar named Jean de Mailly around 1255 contains one of the earliest versions. Another Dominican, Stephen de Bourbon, included the story in his work around the same time. The most detailed medieval account comes from a Polish chronicler named Martin of Opava, writing in the 1270s. These 13th century writers presented the story as fact, and it was repeated by many subsequent medieval chroniclers. Sex 1.5. The tale appeared in popular works like Boccaccio's On Famous Women and was included in some editions of The Lives of the Popes. For several centuries, many people, including some in the Church, accepted Pope Joan as a historical figure. However, no contemporary evidence supports her existence. Sex 1.0. The 9th century, when Joan supposedly lived, is actually one of the better documented periods of papal history. Detailed records exist of the papal succession during this time, and there is no gap that could accommodate Joan's reign. Pope Leo IV died on July 17, 855. 1.5. Pope Benedict III was elected on September 29th and consecrated on October 7th of the same year. The 2-month gap between Leo's death and Benedict's consecration is fully accounted for by the election process and various political complications. Benedict's election was initially contested by an antipope named Anastasius, and this conflict is well documented in contemporary sources. Contemporary chronicles from the 9th century make no mention of any Pope Joan. Sex 1.0. The Liber Pontificalis, official papal chronicle, maintained continuously from the 6th century onward, records Leo IV, followed directly by Benedict III, with detailed information about both pontificates. 9th century letters, charters, and other documents show a clear succession with no interruption. The claimed markers and monuments to Pope Joan that medieval travelers reported seeing in Rome have never been conclusively identified. The statue supposedly marking where she gave birth was actually an ancient Roman statue unconnected to any medieval pope. The streets supposedly avoided by later popes were used regularly in papal processions, as documented in ceremonial records. The special chair allegedly used to verify the new pope's sex did exist, but it was an ancient Roman birthing chair repurposed for papal ceremonies. Its unusual design had nothing to do with Pope Joan. The crude phrase supposedly used during its employment is not found in any actual coronation records. So where did the legend come from? Scholars suggest several possibilities. The story may have begun as an anti-papal satire during a period of intense conflict between the papacy and secular rulers. The 13th century, when the story first appeared in writing, saw bitter disputes between popes and emperors. Inventing a story of a female impostor who became pope would have been a way to mock papal authority. The legend may also reflect medieval anxieties about women and power. The idea of a woman successfully deceiving the entire church hierarchy and reaching its highest office both fascinated and horrified medieval audiences. The story's gruesome ending, with Joan killed for her deception, reinforced traditional gender hierarchies. Some scholars have suggested the legend might have originated in confusion about Pope John VIII, who reigned from 872 to 882. This pope was considered weak and ineffectual by his contemporaries, and some later writers may have exaggerated descriptions of his supposed effeminacy into a legend that he was actually a woman. However, this theory is speculative and not widely accepted. The name John Anglicus, or John of England, may have been confused with John XX, also called John Anglicus, who was actually Portuguese despite the nickname. Medieval chronologies sometimes contained errors and confusions, and the Pope Joan legend may have grown from such a mistake. During the Protestant Reformation, the Pope Joan legend was enthusiastically promoted by Protestant writers as evidence of Catholic corruption. Even though many Catholic scholars had already debunked the story, Protestants used it as propaganda against the papacy. The legend appeared in countless Reformation-era pamphlets and books. In response, Catholic scholars produced detailed refutations of the Pope Joan legend in the 16th and 17th centuries. Fuck meta! They pointed out the lack of contemporary evidence, the impossibility of fitting Joan's reign into the known chronology, and the late appearance of the story. By the 17th century, most educated people recognized that Pope Joan was a legend rather than history. Yet the story persisted in popular culture. It appeared in novels, plays, and later in films. Some feminist writers reclaimed Pope Joan as a symbol of female capability and the injustice of women's exclusion from religious authority. The legend's cultural life extended far beyond its historical credibility. Modern scholars view Pope Joan as a medieval legend that served various purposes. It expressed anxieties about female power, provided material for anti-papal propaganda, and offered a fascinating story that captured imaginations. The tale's persistence for centuries demonstrates how legends can become embedded in historical consciousness despite a lack of evidence. As we consider this story, we might reflect on how easily fiction can become accepted as history. For hundreds of years, many intelligent, educated people believed that a woman had once become pope through deception. They believed it not because of evidence, but because the story resonated with their assumptions about women, power, and the church. The legend of Pope Joan reminds us to question what we think we know about the past. A story repeated often enough can acquire the appearance of truth, even when no factual basis supports it. Yet, understanding these legends and why they were created can tell us much about the people who invented and believed them. St. George and the Dragon, a martyr's myth. St. George, the patron saint of England, Portugal, and numerous other places, is renowned for his legendary battle with a dragon. Images of George slaying the dragon appear on flags, coins, and monuments across the world. Yet the dragon story was added to George's legend centuries after his death, and even his basic biography is largely mythical. There likely was a historical George who was martyred for his Christian faith, probably in the early 4th century, during the reign of the Roman Emperor Diocletian. This persecution of Christians, which began around 303, was one of the most severe in Roman history. Many Christians were executed for refusing to make sacrifices to the Roman gods, and George may have been among them. The earliest reliable information about St. George comes from the late 4th and early 5th centuries. He was venerated as a martyr, and churches were dedicated to him in the eastern Mediterranean region. However, details of his life were sparse. He was believed to have been a soldier, possibly of high rank, who was tortured and executed for his faith. Beyond these basic facts, almost everything else about St. George is legendary embellishment. Various accounts from the 5th and 6th centuries began adding colourful details to his martyrdom. These texts, collectively known as the Passio Georgii, describe elaborate tortures that George survived through divine intervention. According to these legendary accounts, George was placed on a wheel of swords, but the wheel broke. He was forced to drink poison, but it did not harm him. He was enclosed in a box of knives, thrown into boiling water, and subjected to various other torments, emerging unscathed each time. Eventually, he was beheaded, but not before his miraculous survivals had converted thousands to Christianity. These miracle-filled passion narratives were declared apocryphal by Pope Gelasius I in 494, meaning they were not considered reliable. The Pope acknowledged that George was honored as a martyr, but stated that his acts were known only to God, not to men. This suggests that even in the 5th century, the biographical details about George were recognized as uncertain. The dragon story does not appear in any of these early accounts. For the first 800 years of his veneration, St. George was associated with martyrdom, not dragon slaying. The dragon legend emerged much later, first appearing in written form in the 11th century. The earliest known version of the dragon story comes from Georgian sources, though the tale likely developed over time through oral tradition. The most famous version was popularized by Jacobus de Veragiane in his 13th century compilation, The Golden Legend. According to this version, a dragon lived in a lake near the city of Cyllene in Libya. The creature poisoned the countryside with its breath, and the citizens had to offer it sheep to keep it at bay. When sheep were no longer sufficient, they began sacrificing their children, chosen by lottery. Eventually, the king's daughter was selected for sacrifice. She was led to the lake and left for the dragon. George, a Christian knight traveling through the region, encountered her and learned of her plight. When the dragon emerged, George made the sign of the cross, charged the beast on horseback, and struck it with his lance, severely wounding it. He then instructed the princess to tie her girdle around the dragon's neck. The creature became docile, and she led it back to the city like a dog on a leash. George told the terrified citizens that he would kill the dragon if they all converted to Christianity. The king and all his subjects agreed. George slew the dragon, and thousands were baptized. This story bears no resemblance to the probable historical reality of George's life and death. It is clearly a medieval romance, incorporating elements common to many similar tales. The motif of a knight rescuing a maiden from a monster, widespread in medieval literature and folklore. Scholars have noted similarities between the George legend and ancient myths, particularly the Greek story of Perseus rescuing Andromeda from a sea monster. Other cultures had similar tales, such as the Norse legend of Sigurd slaying the dragon Fafnir. The George story may have been influenced by these earlier traditions. The location given in the legend, Cyllene in Libya, is itself problematic. No city by that name existed in Libya during George's lifetime. Some scholars suggest it may have been a misreading or corruption of Cyrene, a real ancient city in Libya, but there is no historical evidence connecting George to that region. The dragon in medieval literature often symbolized paganism or Satan, and George's victory over the dragon represented Christianity's triumph over evil. The story thus functioned as religious allegory rather than historical narrative. The princess represented the church or the human soul, endangered by evil but saved through faith and divine intervention. George's association with England developed during the Crusades. Returning crusaders brought back stories of George appearing to help Christian armies in battle. Richard the Lionheart placed his army under George's protection during the Third Crusade in the 1190s. Edward III made George the patron saint of England in 1348, when he founded the Order of the Garter. The dragon story became particularly popular in England, and the image of St. George slaying the dragon became a national symbol. It appeared on the Great Seal of King Edward IV, on coins, and eventually on the English flag. The legend was performed in medieval mystery plays and celebrated in festivals. During the Renaissance, artists created countless paintings and sculptures depicting George and the dragon. The scene became one of the most frequently portrayed subjects in Christian art, despite having no basis in the saint's actual life or early legends. In the 20th century, scholarship on Saint George attempted to separate the historical figure from the legendary accretions. The Roman Catholic Church, while continuing to honor George as a saint, removed him from the universal calendar in 1969, acknowledging the lack of reliable historical information about his life. He was restored to the calendar in 2000 as an optional memorial. Modern historians generally accept that a Christian named George was probably martyred in the early 4th century, possibly at Lydda in Palestine. Beyond this, little can be said with certainty. He may have been a soldier, as tradition claims, but even this is uncertain. The detailed stories of his martyrdom are legendary, and the dragon story is entirely medieval fiction. Yet the legend of Saint George has had real historical impact. The image of the saint slaying the dragon has inspired countless people, symbolizing the victory of good over evil, courage in the face of overwhelming odds, and the power of faith. Nations have adopted him as their patron, armies have fought under his banner, and his feast day has been celebrated for centuries. The disconnect between the probable historical George and the legendary George reminds us that historical figures can become vehicles for cultural meaning that transcends their actual lives. A soldier who died for his faith in Roman Palestine became a dragon-slaying knight, a symbol of chivalry and a patron of nations, because later generations needed such a figure and reshaped his story to meet that need. As we reflect on St. George, we might consider how the stories we tell about historical figures often reveal more about the storytellers than about the historical reality. The dragon was never real, and George almost certainly never fought one. But the meaning people found in that story was real. Sometimes the myths we create matter more than the facts we discover. Pythagoras, the philosopher whose teachings were invented by his followers. Pythagoras of Samos, the ancient Greek philosopher and mathematician, is remembered for the Pythagorean theorem, his mystical beliefs, and his influential school of thought. Yet virtually everything we think we know about Pythagoras was written by others centuries after his death, and much of it appears to have been invented by his followers. Pythagoras likely lived from around 570 to 495 BCE. He was born on the island of Samos in the eastern Aegean Sea. In his middle age, he migrated to Croton, a Greek colony in southern Italy, where he founded a philosophical and religious community. This community, which became known as the Pythagorean school, combined mathematical and scientific inquiry with mystical and religious beliefs. These basic facts are about all we can say with reasonable confidence about the historical Pythagoras. He wrote nothing down, or if he did, none of his writings have survived. Every claim about his life, teachings, and discoveries comes from sources written hundreds of years after his death. The earliest mentions of Pythagoras come from writers who lived within a century of his death. Heraclitus, writing around 500 BCE, mentioned Pythagoras but was dismissive of him. Herodotus, the historian writing in the mid-5th century BCE, mentioned Pythagoras briefly. These early references tell us almost nothing about Pythagoras's actual teachings or activities. More detailed accounts began appearing in the 4th century BCE, over 100 years after Pythagoras's death. Aristotle wrote about the Pythagoreans, but he typically distinguished between what Pythagoras himself taught and what his later followers believed. Aristotle's student, Aristoxenus, wrote a biography of Pythagoras, now lost, or developed a new doctrine. They would attribute it to Pythagoras himself, even though he had died long before. This practice makes it nearly impossible to determine what Pythagoras actually taught. The famous Pythagorean theorem, which states that in a right triangle, the square of the hypotenuse equals the sum of the squares of the other two sides, is a perfect example. Tradition credits this discovery to Pythagoras, and it has borne his name for over 2 millennia. However, there is no reliable evidence that Pythagoras discovered or proved this theorem. Babylonian mathematicians knew and used this relationship over 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. Clay tablets from around 1800 BCE show that Babylonian scribes understood the theorem and could calculate the sides of right triangles. Whether they had a general proof or just knew it worked in specific cases is unclear, but they certainly knew the relationship. The ancient Egyptians and Indians also appear to have known the theorem or something very similar. The first explicit statement and proof of the theorem in Greek mathematics doesn't appear until Euclid's Elements, written around 300 BCE, 200 years after Pythagoras died. Euclid does not attribute the theorem to Pythagoras. So how did Pythagoras get credit for it? Later Pythagorean writers, and then Roman and medieval scholars who relied on their accounts, attributed the theorem to Pythagoras. This attribution became traditional, repeated so often that it became accepted as fact, even though no early source supports it. The same problem affects most of what we associate with Pythagoras. The idea that all is number, supposedly central to Pythagorean philosophy, cannot be reliably traced to Pythagoras himself. The concept may have developed over time within the Pythagorean school, then been projected back onto the founder. The famous story of Pythagoras discovering the mathematical ratios underlying musical harmony is also highly questionable. According to legend, Pythagoras passed a blacksmith's shop and noticed that hammers of different weights produced different musical tones when they struck an anvil. He supposedly went home and conducted experiments with strings and discovered that musical intervals correspond to simple mathematical ratios. This story, repeated in countless textbooks and popularizations, is almost certainly fiction. It first appears in sources written 700 years after Pythagoras died. Moreover, the physics described in the story doesn't actually work. The weight of hammers striking an anvil doesn't produce the harmonic relationships described. That Pythagoreans did investigate the mathematics of musical harmony is likely true. The discovery that string length determines pitch and that consonant intervals correspond to simple numerical ratios, like 2:1 for an octave or 3:2 for a perfect fifth, was a genuine and important discovery made by someone in the Pythagorean tradition. But whether Pythagoras himself made this discovery is unknown and unknowable. Many mystical and religious beliefs were attributed to Pythagoras. He supposedly believed in the transmigration of souls, that after death the soul is reborn in another body, human or animal. He allegedly advocated vegetarianism as a result, since animals might contain the souls of deceased humans. He supposedly taught that reality was fundamentally mathematical, that numbers had mystical properties, and that certain symbols and practices were sacred. The Pythagorean communities did follow strict rules. Members supposedly took vows of silence for several years, shared their property communally, and followed various dietary restrictions. They studied mathematics, astronomy, and music, seeing these as paths to understanding the divine order of the cosmos. But which of these practices and beliefs originated with Pythagoras, and which were developed by his followers over the generations? We cannot say. The secrecy of the Pythagorean communities makes the question even more difficult. They did not publicize their teachings, and they attributed all their doctrines to their founder. Later writers added even more legends to Pythagoras' biography. Neoplatonist philosophers in the Roman Empire, particularly Iamblichus and Porphyry, writing in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, produced elaborate biographies of Pythagoras. These works, written 800 years after his death, portrayed Pythagoras as a semi-divine figure who performed miracles. According to these late accounts, Pythagoras could be in 2 places at once. He tamed a dangerous bear through the power of his words. He was bitten by a deadly snake, but the snake died instead. He had a golden thigh, marking him as the son of Apollo. He could remember all his previous incarnations. He descended into Hades and returned to tell of what he saw. These miraculous tales are obvious fabrications, products of a time when philosophers were often portrayed as holy men with supernatural powers. Yet even these late, unreliable biographies became sources for later writers, further obscuring whatever historical reality might have existed. Medieval and Renaissance scholars relied heavily on these late ancient biographies. They accepted the attribution of the Pythagorean theorem to Pythagoras, the stories of his discoveries in music theory, and many of his supposed mystical doctrines. The legendary Pythagoras became the historical Pythagoras in the popular imagination. Modern scholarship has worked to separate legend from potential historical reality. Careful analysis of sources, their dates, their reliability, and their biases has led to a much more modest picture of what we can actually know about Pythagoras. The consensus is that he was a real person who founded an influential philosophical and religious community in southern Italy, but that most specific claims about his life and teachings cannot be verified. The Pythagorean theorem likely was not discovered by Pythagoras. The story of the hammers and the discovery of musical ratios is probably fiction. The detailed mystical doctrines attributed to him were likely developed over time by his school. The miracle stories from late antiquity are certainly inventions. What remains is a shadowy figure, important enough to found a movement that would influence Greek philosophy for centuries, but about whom almost nothing certain can be said. The historical Pythagoras has been almost completely obscured by the legendary Pythagoras created by his followers. This is perhaps fitting for a philosopher who supposedly taught that true knowledge must be kept secret and passed only from teacher to student. Whether intentional or not, Pythagoras and his original teachings have remained secret, hidden behind layers of later attribution, embellishment, and invention. The case of Pythagoras reminds us that antiquity can be as obscure as any dark age. Even for a famous figure from a literate civilization, the passage of time and the absence of contemporary sources can make historical truth almost impossible to recover. The Pythagoras we know is largely a creation of his followers, a collective myth-making project spread over centuries. Yet this legendary Pythagoras had real influence. Whether or not the historical Pythagoras actually believed that all reality was mathematical, this idea attributed to him influenced Plato, and through Plato, much of Western philosophy and science. Sometimes the myth of a historical figure can be more historically important than the reality ever was. Robin Hood, the outlaw who probably never existed. Robin Hood, the heroic outlaw who robbed from the rich and gave to the poor, has been a beloved figure in English folklore for over 7 centuries. Tales of his adventures in Sherwood Forest with his band of merry men, his rivalry with the Sheriff of Nottingham, and his love for Maid Marian have inspired countless ballads, plays, books, and films. Yet the historical Robin Hood, if he existed at all, remains frustratingly elusive. The earliest references to Robin Hood appear in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. These are brief mentions in poems and chronicles that suggest the name was already associated with an outlaw figure. William Langland's allegorical poem, Piers Plowman, written in the 1370s, mentions rhymes of Robin Hood, indicating that Robin Hood ballads were well known by that time. The oldest surviving ballads about Robin Hood date from the 15th century. These early ballads, such as Robin Hood and the Monk and Robin Hood and the Potter, portray Robin as a yeoman, a commoner of some standing but not a nobleman. He is an outlaw living in the forest with his band, engaging in various exploits involving robbery, disguises, and confrontations with corrupt officials. These early ballads are quite different from the Robin Hood we know today. Robin is rough and violent, sometimes killing his enemies without mercy. There is no Maid Marian, no Friar Tuck, and Little John is present but less prominent. Robin is not explicitly described as robbing the rich to give to the poor, though he does show kindness to the poor and opposition to corrupt churchmen and officials. The most important early Robin Hood text is A Guest of Robin Hood, a long ballad compiled around 1450 that stitches together several Robin Hood stories. This version gives us many familiar elements: Robin's base in Sherwood Forest, his conflicts with the Sheriff of Nottingham, his loyalty to King Richard, and his skill with a bow. However, Robin is still a yeoman outlaw, not the dispossessed nobleman of later versions. So was there a real Robin Hood behind these ballads? Many historians have tried to identify a historical basis for the legend, but none have been successful. The problem is that Robert or Robin was an extremely common name in medieval England, and Hood was also not unusual. Court records and chronicles from the 13th and 14th centuries mention various Roberts and Robins described as outlaws, fugitives, or criminals. Some scholars pointed to a Robert Hood mentioned in York court records from 1226 as a possible candidate. Others suggested Robert Hod, a fugitive mentioned in Berkshire records from 1261. A Robert Hood appears as a tenant of the Archbishop of York in 1322. Various other Roberts, Rogers, and Williams with surnames like Hood, Hod, or Hobhod appear in scattered documents. None of these figures match the Robin Hood of legend very well. They are typically just names in legal documents, with no heroic deeds or forest adventures attached. Some were clearly criminals, but petty ones, not folk heroes. The dates often don't align with the periods suggested in the ballads. Most importantly, none of these documented individuals seem to have been famous enough to generate the rich body of legend that existed by the 15th century. Another theory suggests that Robin Hood was not a real person, but an archetypal figure, a generic name applied to various outlaws and rebels. FAQ 1.5. Robin Hood may have been a nickname or alias used by multiple criminals, or a legendary name that real outlaws deliberately adopted. Court records from the 14th century sometimes use Robin Hood or Rob Hod as a surname or alias for criminals, suggesting the name had already become associated with outlawry. The elements of the Robin Hood legend have parallels in the legends of other cultures. the noble or skilled outlaw living in the forest, resisting unjust authority and helping the oppressed, is a widespread folktale motif. Medieval France had similar legends of forest outlaws. The story of William Tell shares themes with Robin Hood, a commoner defying tyrannical authority through exceptional skill with a projectile weapon. It's possible that the Robin Hood legend began as a collection of stories about various outlaws and rebels, gradually coalescing around a single name. Folk ballads often work this way, with historical fragments, folktale motifs, and pure invention blending together until separating them becomes impossible. As the legend developed, Robin Hood's story was elaborated and modified to reflect changing social values. In the 16th century, the playwright Anthony Munday transformed Robin Hood from a yeoman outlaw into Robert, Earl of Huntingdon, a nobleman wrongly dispossessed of his lands. This version made Robin a figure of the aristocracy brought low by injustice, rather than a commoner challenging authority. Munday also introduced Maid Marian as Robin's love interest. Marian had actually originated in separate French pastoral traditions and in English May games, where she appeared as a character unconnected to Robin Hood. Munday merged these traditions, making Marian into Robin's aristocratic lover who joins him in the forest. This romantic subplot became central to most later versions of the legend. Friar Tuck, another familiar character, also came from a different tradition initially. References to a Friar Tuck appear in the early 15th century, but not clearly connected to Robin Hood. He may have been a separate outlaw or a character from folk celebrations. By the early 16th century, Friar Tuck had been integrated into the Robin Hood legend. The famous principle that Robin Hood robbed from the rich to give to the poor is not explicit in the earliest ballads. While Robin does show generosity to poor knights and appears to oppose corrupt officials and wealthy churchmen, the systematic redistribution of wealth associated with him is a later addition to the legend. This element probably developed gradually, becoming more prominent as the legend was adapted for later audiences. The connection to King Richard the Lionheart is also a later addition. Early ballads mention Edward our king, possibly referring to Edward II or Edward III. The idea that Robin was outlawed during King Richard's absence on crusade, and that Richard eventually pardoned Robin and restored justice, appears in later versions. This added a historical framework and a satisfying resolution to the story. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Robin Hood had become a celebrated figure in English popular culture. However, he was somewhat sanitized, transformed from a rough outlaw into a genteel hero. Later Victorian writers further romanticized the legend, emphasizing chivalry, romance, and noble ideals. The 20th century saw an explosion of Robin Hood adaptations in film and television. Each era reimagined Robin according to its own values. A swashbuckling hero in early films, a champion of social justice in mid-century versions, a gritty, realistic figure in some modern adaptations. Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, made him a returning crusader fighting Norman oppression of Saxons, adding a layer of ethnic conflict to the story. The BBC's Robin Hood series portrayed him as a soldier traumatized by war. Each version reflected its time's concerns. Modern historians generally conclude that if a historical Robin Hood existed, we know nothing about him. The legend likely developed from a combination of stories about various outlaws, folk-tale motifs, social criticism directed at corrupt officials and wealthy clergy, and pure literary invention. By the time Robin Hood appears in written records, he is already a legendary figure, not a historical person. The setting of Sherwood Forest is real enough. It was a royal forest near Nottingham, subject to harsh forest laws that made it illegal for commoners to hunt deer. The Sheriff of Nottingham was a real office. These authentic historical elements gave the legend a sense of reality, even if the stories themselves were fiction. The appeal of the Robin Hood legend lies in its themes. It was a royal forest near Nottingham, subject to harsh forest laws that made it illegal for commoners to hunt deer. The Sheriff of Nottingham was a real office. These authentic historical elements gave the legend a sense of reality, even if the stories themselves were fiction. The appeal of the Robin Hood legend lies in its themes: resistance to injustice, loyalty to friends, skill and cleverness triumphing over power and wealth, and living free in nature away from corrupt civilization. These themes resonated in medieval England and continue to resonate today. Whether Robin Hood was ever a real person matters less than what he represents. The legend has been politically flexible, appropriated by different groups for different purposes. Medieval audiences may have seen Robin as a figure who exposed the corruption of officials while remaining loyal to the rightful king. Later audiences emphasized his redistribution of wealth. Some modern interpretations present him as a proto-socialist revolutionary, others as a libertarian individual resisting oppressive government. As we settle deeper into rest, we might reflect on how a name mentioned in a few medieval ballads became one of the most famous legendary figures in English culture. Shit meta. Sex 1.5. Whether the historical Robin Hood ever existed is perhaps less important than the fact that medieval England needed a Robin Hood, needed stories of the underdog triumphing over corruption, and created a legend that would endure for centuries. The Greenwood, the bow and arrow, the band of loyal companions, the beautiful maiden, the corrupt sheriff, the absent king, all these elements combined to create a story that each generation could adapt to its own needs. Sex 1.0. Robin Hood never existed as we imagine him, but perhaps he exists in a different way, as an enduring symbol of resistance to injustice and hope for a more equitable world. Nero fiddling while Rome burned. The emperor who never played. The image of the Roman Emperor Nero playing his fiddle while Rome burned in the Great Fire of 64 CE has become a powerful metaphor for indifferent leadership during a crisis. Sex 1.5. The story has been repeated countless times as historical fact. Yet Nero did not fiddle while Rome burned. And not just because the fire didn't happen quite as the story suggests, but because fiddles didn't exist in ancient Rome. The Great Fire of Rome was a real and devastating event. 1.0. It began on the night of July 18, 64 CE, in the merchant area of the Circus Maximus. Fanned by summer winds, the fire spread rapidly through Rome's densely packed wooden buildings. It burned for 6 days, destroying much of the city. 3 of Rome's 14 districts were completely destroyed, and 7 more were severely damaged. The fire caused tremendous loss of life and property. 1.5. Hundreds, possibly thousands of people died. Tens of thousands lost their homes. Many of Rome's oldest temples and monuments were destroyed. The fire was one of the worst disasters in Roman history, and its impact on the city and empire was profound. Contemporary accounts of the fire do exist. 1.0. The historian Tacitus, writing about 50 years after the event, provided a detailed description. So did Suetonius, writing slightly later, and Cassius Dio, writing in the 3rd century. These ancient sources are the basis for what we know about the fire and Nero's response to it. None of these sources say that Nero fiddled while Rome burned. 1.5. The fiddle, or violin, was not invented until the 16th century, over 1400 years after the fire. No ancient stringed instrument quite like a fiddle existed in Roman times. The lyre, a kind of harp, was the most common stringed instrument, but it was played by plucking, not with a bow. So where did the story come from? 1.0. Tacitus and Suetonius both mention that Nero was an enthusiastic performer who fancied himself a great artist. He played the lyre, sang, and wrote poetry. He loved performing before audiences, often compelling senators and other dignitaries to attend his recitals. His artistic pretensions were a source of mockery among Rome's elite. Tacitus records that there were rumors Nero sang about the destruction of Troy while Rome burned, though Tacitus himself is skeptical about this claim. Suetonius more explicitly states that Nero watched the fire from the Tower of Maecenas and, delighted by what he called the beauty of the flames, performed his poem about the fall of Troy. These accounts, written decades after the fire, reflect hostile traditions about Nero. Nero had many enemies among Rome's senatorial class, the class to which these historians belonged. After Nero's death, his reputation was systematically blackened by his successors and their supporters. Many stories about Nero's cruelty, depravity, and incompetence were likely exaggerated or invented as part of this posthumous character assassination. The detail about Nero performing during the fire may be one such exaggeration or invention. However, even if we accept it as true, it's not the same as the familiar image of Nero fiddling while Rome burned. The ancient sources describe Nero performing a dramatic poem, not carelessly playing music. The poem about Troy's destruction might even be seen as a response to the disaster, a way of processing the catastrophe through art, however inappropriate that response might seem to us. Moreover, Tacitus tells us that Nero was not even in Rome when the fire started. He was at his villa in Antium, about 35 miles away. When news of the fire reached him, he hurried back to Rome and immediately began organizing relief efforts. According to Tacitus, Nero opened his own gardens to refugees from the fire. He arranged for emergency grain supplies to be brought in. He supervised firefighting efforts and the clearing of debris. He personally participated in relief work. These actions do not suggest an emperor indifferent to his city's suffering. Nero also undertook a massive rebuilding program after the fire. He imposed new building codes requiring stone construction and wider streets to prevent future fires from spreading so easily. He planned a new layout for the city with better urban design. Whatever his other faults, Nero responded to the disaster with significant practical measures. However, Nero's rebuilding plans included a massive new palace complex for himself, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. This sprawling palace, with its gardens, lakes, and lavish decorations, occupied a huge area in the heart of Rome. Its construction required appropriating property where fire victims had lived. This gave rise to rumors that Nero had deliberately started the fire to clear space for his palace. Tacitus reports these rumors but doesn't endorse them. He notes that they were widespread and that Nero tried to deflect blame by accusing Christians of starting the fire. This led to the first major Roman persecution of Christians, in which many were tortured and executed in gruesome ways. Nero's scapegoating of Christians became one of the most notorious aspects of his reign. The transformation of the story from Nero recited poetry to Nero fiddled appears to have occurred during the Renaissance or early modern period. As ancient sources were translated and popularized, details were altered, either through misunderstanding, deliberate embellishment, or cultural translation. Someone probably substituted the contemporary instrument, the fiddle, for the ancient lyre, not realizing they were very different. The phrase "fiddling while Rome burns" entered English as an idiom for irresponsible behavior during a crisis. It became so common that many people assumed it referred to a historical event. The image is vivid and memorable: a decadent emperor caring only for his entertainment, playing music while his city burns and his people suffer. This image fit with the broader picture of Nero that had been inherited from ancient sources and developed over centuries. Nero was remembered as one of the worst Roman emperors, a murderer who killed his own mother, a tyrant who persecuted Christians, a madman who fancied himself an artist. The story of him fiddling while Rome burned fit this characterization perfectly, so it was accepted and repeated. Modern scholarship has complicated the traditional view of Nero. While he was certainly a flawed and often cruel ruler, some of the worst stories about him appear to be exaggerations or inventions by his enemies. His early years as emperor saw competent administration, largely guided by his tutor Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus. His later years were marked by increasing paranoia and tyranny, but some of his alleged crimes may have been attributed to him posthumously. The Great Fire of Rome was a genuine catastrophe, and Nero's response to it was actually reasonably effective in some ways. He did not start the fire, despite ancient rumors. He did not play music indifferently while the city burned. The familiar story is a myth, based on distorted ancient sources, filtered through centuries of retelling and altered by the substitution of a modern instrument for an ancient one. Yet the myth has become more famous than the reality. Nero fiddling while Rome burns is a phrase everyone knows, even people who know nothing else about Roman history. It serves as a powerful cautionary tale about leadership and responsibility, even though the event it purports to describe never happened. The case of Nero reminds us that a person's historical reputation can be determined more by their enemies than by their actual deeds. Roman historians who wrote about Nero belonged to the class he had threatened and offended. They had every reason to portray him in the worst possible light. And they did. Later generations inherited this hostile portrait and embellished it further. As we consider Nero's story, we might reflect on how easily a false detail, a vivid image, can become attached to a historical figure and overshadow more complex truths. Nero had real faults. He murdered family members, including his mother. He was vain and petty. He scapegoated innocent Christians for a fire he didn't start. These actual crimes are serious enough without inventing new ones. But the invented image of Nero fiddling while Rome burned proved more memorable and useful than the complex reality. Sometimes a myth serves purposes that truth cannot, providing a simple, powerful lesson even at the cost of historical accuracy. The emperor who played his lyre while his city burned never existed, but the metaphor he represents continues to resonate whenever leaders seem indifferent to the suffering of those they govern. Christopher Columbus, the Flat Earth Myth. Christopher Columbus is remembered as the explorer who proved the Earth was round by sailing west to reach Asia and accidentally discovering the Americas instead. According to popular belief, Columbus faced skepticism from experts who thought the Earth was flat and that he would sail off the edge of the world. This dramatic story of one man's bold vision against ignorant opposition has been taught to generations of schoolchildren. It is almost entirely fiction. Educated people in Columbus's time knew perfectly well that the Earth was round. This knowledge dated back to ancient Greece. Pythagoras and Aristotle had argued for a spherical Earth centuries before Christ. Eratosthenes had calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy in the 3rd century BCE. This knowledge had never been lost in medieval Europe. Medieval scholars, educated in the universities and the church, understood the earth to be spherical. Thomas Aquinas, Dante, Roger Bacon, and countless other medieval intellectuals took the earth's sphericity for granted. Medieval world maps might look strange to us, with Jerusalem at the center and continents oddly shaped, but they represented a sphere, not a flat disk. Columbus faced skepticism from the experts of his time, but not because they thought the earth was flat. They rejected his proposal because they correctly understood that Asia was far farther away to the west than Columbus claimed. Columbus had calculated that Japan lay about 2,400 miles west of the Canary Islands. His estimate was based on several errors. He used a smaller value for the degree of latitude than was standard, making the Earth's circumference smaller than it actually is. He also overestimated how far east Asia extended, bringing Japan closer to Europe from the west. The experts Columbus consulted, including a commission appointed by the Spanish monarchs, correctly rejected his calculations. They knew the Earth was larger than Columbus thought, and that Asia was therefore much farther away. They warned that Columbus's ships could not possibly carry enough supplies for such a long voyage. They were absolutely right. The actual distance from the Canary Islands to Japan, sailing west, is about 12,000 miles, not 2,400. Columbus's ships could never have made such a journey. If the Americas had not existed, Columbus and his crew would have died at sea, starved, or died of thirst long before reaching Asia. Columbus was saved by a colossal stroke of luck. A previously unknown continent happened to lie roughly where he thought Asia would be. When he reached the Caribbean islands, he believed he had reached the East Indies, islands off the coast of Asia. He called the indigenous people Indians, a name that stuck despite being based on a complete misunderstanding of where he was. Columbus went to his grave believing he had reached Asia. He never acknowledged that he had found a new continent, although by his later voyages he knew something was not quite right. His calculations and his theories were wrong, and the experts who rejected his plan were correct. Columbus succeeded not because he was right, but because he was lucky. So where did the flat Earth myth come from? The story appears to have been largely invented in the 19th century, particularly by the American writer Washington Irving. In 1828, Irving published A History of the Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus, a dramatized and fictionalized account of the explorer's life. Irving invented a scene where Columbus appeared before the Council of Salamanca to defend his plan. In Irving's telling, the council members were ignorant clergy who argued that the earth was flat, citing biblical passages. Columbus, the enlightened man of science, heroically defended the truth of the spherical earth. It is a dramatic scene, perfectly suited to romantic notions of progress and the conflict between science and religion. It is also complete fiction. The Council of Salamanca did exist, and Columbus did present his case to various experts and officials. But there is no evidence that anyone argued the earth was flat. The objections to Columbus's plan were scientific and practical. The distance was too great. The ships could not carry enough supplies. The voyage was impossible. Irving's fiction was picked up by other writers and popularized. In 1874, John William Draper published History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, which portrayed the Middle Ages as a dark age of superstition and ignorance, with religious authorities suppressing scientific knowledge. The Columbus story fit this narrative perfectly, and Draper repeated Irving's fictional account as if it were fact. Andrew Dickson White's 1896 work, A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, further spread the flat earth myth. White portrayed the Columbus story as an example of religious obscurantism opposing scientific progress. His influential book was widely read and taught, spreading the myth to new generations. The flat earth story became standard in American education by the late 19th century. It served several purposes. It made Columbus. It reinforced ideas about European superiority over indigenous peoples by portraying Columbus's contemporaries as ignorant and backward, making the discovery of America seem more impressive. It also fit contemporary conflicts between science and religion by projecting those conflicts backward onto the past. The Columbus flat earth myth became so entrenched that debunking it has proven difficult. Scholars have been pointing out its falsity for over a century, but it persists in popular culture. Many people still believe that medieval Europeans thought the earth was flat, that Columbus proved them wrong, and that this was a significant part of his achievement. In reality, the medieval world's understanding of the earth's shape was far more sophisticated than the myth suggests. Medieval scholars knew not only that the earth was round, but had remarkably accurate estimates of its size. They understood geography, astronomy, and mathematics at levels that would not be surpassed for centuries. The myth also oversimplifies Columbus himself. He was a skilled navigator and a courageous explorer, but he was also motivated by gold and glory as much as by any spirit of scientific inquiry. He enslaved indigenous people. His governorship of Hispaniola was marked by cruelty, and he never admitted his geographical errors. He is a complex and often troubling historical figure, not a simple hero of progress. The real story of Columbus's voyages is actually more interesting than the myth. He was wrong about the Earth's size and Asia's location. The experts were right to reject his plan, and he succeeded only because of the lucky accident of the Americas being where they were. This story of error, luck, and unintended consequences is more historically valuable than a false tale of enlightenment triumphing over ignorance. The flat earth myth tells us more about the 19th century when it was invented than about the 15th century when Columbus sailed. It reflects 19th century assumptions about progress, science, religion, and the superiority of modern Western civilization. It served to legitimate contemporary power structures and beliefs by projecting them onto the past. As we settle further into rest, we might consider how the Columbus myth persists despite being thoroughly debunked. Shit meta. Sex 1.5. It persists because it serves a purpose, because it tells a story people want to believe, because it makes complex history simple and provides clear heroes and villains. Facts alone are not enough to dispel a myth that fulfills these needs. The irony is that by making Columbus a hero who proved the earth was round, the myth actually diminishes the real achievement of the ancient Greeks and medieval scholars who figured out the Earth's shape and size through careful observation and mathematical reasoning. Sex 1.0. They deserve credit for this scientific accomplishment, but the myth gave that credit to Columbus instead, even though he rejected their accurate calculations. History is complicated, filled with errors, accidents, and unintended consequences. Simplifying it into tales of heroes and villains may make for better stories, but those stories often distort our understanding of the past. Columbus did not prove the earth was round. Medieval scholars did not think it was flat, and the experts who rejected Columbus's plan were actually correct. The truth is always more complex than the myth. George Washington and the Cherry Tree, a fabricated tale of honesty. One of the most famous stories from George Washington's childhood tells of him chopping down his father's prized cherry tree and then confessing to the deed, saying, "I cannot tell a lie." This tale has been used for over 2 centuries to teach children about the importance of honesty. The only problem is that the story never happened. The cherry tree story first appeared in print in 1800, the year after Washington died, in a book by Mason Locke Weems, better known as Parson Weems. Weems was an itinerant minister, bookseller, and writer who specialized in moralizing biographies. His life of George Washington was intended less as history than as a vehicle for teaching moral lessons, particularly to young readers. The book was enormously popular. It went through dozens of editions and was read by countless American schoolchildren throughout the 19th century. Many Americans learned about Washington's life primarily or entirely from Weems's book, accepting its stories as factual. In the cherry tree anecdote, as Weems told it, young George Washington received a hatchet as a gift and was delighted with his new tool. Testing its sharpness, he chopped at various things around the plantation, eventually barking a young English cherry tree that his father had prized. When his father discovered the damaged tree, he was angry and demanded to know who had harmed it. Young George, though knowing he would be punished, could not lie to his father. "I can't tell a lie, Pa. You know I can't tell a lie. I did cut it with my hatchet," he confessed. His father, impressed by his son's honesty, embraced him and said he would rather lose 1,000 trees than have his son tell a lie. It is a charming story with a clear moral message. It portrays Washington as honest from childhood, suggesting that his character was formed early and remained consistent throughout his life. It makes honesty seem natural and rewarding, while lying appears both wrong and unnecessary. There is no evidence that any version of this story occurred. Weems never claimed to have witnessed the incident, which would have happened decades before his time. He provided no source for the story, no earlier account from which he learned it. It appears nowhere in Washington's papers or in the recollections of his family members. Washington's family and close associates, interviewed by early biographers, knew nothing of the cherry tree story. When Weems's book appeared with this anecdote, no one came forward to confirm it. No one said, "Yes, I remember hearing about that," or "Washington's mother told me that story." The silence from those who actually knew Washington as a child is telling. The story has all the hallmarks of a moral fable rather than a historical anecdote. It is too perfectly constructed, with its clear moral lesson and satisfying resolution. Real childhood incidents are usually messier, more ambiguous, less morally straightforward. The story reads like what it almost certainly is, a fictional tale crafted to illustrate a virtue. Weems had a history of embellishing and inventing stories in his biographies. He admitted in a letter that he was trying to make Washington's character attractive to young readers, writing, "I am apt to think that youth is the season to liken them to Washington." His goal was not historical accuracy, but moral instruction. Some of Weems's other stories about Washington were also dubious or false. He claimed to have witnessed events he could not have seen and reported conversations he could not have heard. Historians have long recognized that Weems was an unreliable source, more of a mythmaker than a historian. The cherry tree story served several purposes in early 19th century America. The young United States was still forming its national identity, and Washington had become the central figure in American mythology. Stories about Washington helped define American values and give the new nation a heroic founding figure. The emphasis on honesty in the Cherry Tree story was particularly significant. The early republic depended on citizens being trustworthy, keeping commitments, and dealing honestly with each other. Commercial relationships required trust. Democratic government required citizens to be honest in their dealings and true to their word. The Cherry Tree story taught these values through an appealing narrative about the nation's most revered figure. The story also portrayed Washington's father as a wise and loving parent who valued honesty above property. This reflected evolving ideas about child-rearing in the early 19th century, which increasingly emphasized moral education over physical punishment. The father in the story does not beat his son, but praises his honesty, rewarding virtue rather than punishing the mistake. As the 19th century progressed, Washington became increasingly mythologized. He was portrayed as a figure of perfect virtue, almost superhuman in his moral excellence. The Cherry Tree story fit this idealized image, suggesting that Washington had been exceptional from early childhood. Historians in the late 19th and early 20th centuries began questioning Weems's stories. They pointed out the lack of evidence for the Cherry Tree incident and other anecdotes. Scholarly biographies of Washington began omitting the story or noting that it was probably fictitious. Yet the story remained popular in children's books and school curricula. The Cherry Tree story became so famous that it transcended its questionable origins. It became part of American folklore, a story everyone knew, regardless of whether anyone believed it actually happened. The phrase, "I cannot tell a lie," became proverbial, used to introduce honest admissions, or, sometimes ironically, to precede obvious falsehoods. In the 20th century, as debunking the story became common, it created an interesting paradox. A story intended to teach the importance of honesty was itself a lie, or at least a fiction presented as truth. This irony has not been lost on commentators, who have noted that using a false story to teach truthfulness is deeply problematic. Some defenders have argued that the story still has value as a moral fable, even if historically false. Like Aesop's fables about talking animals, the Cherry Tree story can teach an important lesson without being literally true. The question is whether it should be presented as history when it is actually fiction. Modern historians emphasize the importance of distinguishing between historical fact and inspirational myth. Washington was an important and admirable figure in many ways, but he was also a real, complex human being with flaws and contradictions. He owned slaves throughout his life. He could be vain and status-conscious. He made mistakes as a military commander and as president. The real George Washington is actually more interesting and more instructive than the mythical, perfect Washington of the Cherry Tree story. His actual struggles, his growth as a leader, his attempts to live up to the ideals of the Revolution while navigating practical realities, these offer more valuable historical lessons than a fabricated tale of childhood honesty. The Cherry Tree myth also illustrates how historical figures become vehicles for the values and concerns of later generations. Parson Weems created a Washington who embodied the virtues that early 19th century Americans wanted to see in their national hero and wanted to instill in their children. The mythical Washington tells us more about Weems's America than about the actual 18th century Virginia planter and revolutionary leader. As we reflect on this story, we might consider how many historical anecdotes we have learned are actually later inventions. The myths that cultures create about their heroes often reveal what those cultures value, even when the stories themselves are false. George Washington never chopped down a cherry tree, but millions of Americans learned about honesty from a story about him doing exactly that. The persistence of the cherry tree myth, even after it was widely known to be false, shows the power of a good story. Facts may be important, but narratives shape how we understand those facts. A false but meaningful story can have more cultural impact than a true but less compelling account. The George Washington who cannot tell a lie is more useful to moral education than the complex, flawed, real George Washington ever could be. Yet perhaps we sell our children short by preferring comfortable myths to complex truths. Maybe the real Washington, with all his contradictions and challenges, could teach more valuable lessons than the sanitized, mythical version. The genuine human being who struggled to live up to high ideals, who sometimes succeeded and sometimes failed, who grew and changed throughout his life, offers a model of moral development that a perfect, fictional child cannot provide. Betsy Ross and the First American Flag, a story created by her grandson. The story of Betsy Ross sewing the first American flag is one of the most enduring tales in American history. According to tradition, in June 1776, George Washington and two other members of a secret committee visited Betsy Ross at her Philadelphia upholstery shop. They showed her a sketch of a flag with 13 stars and 13 stripes, representing the 13 colonies. Betsy suggested changes, including using 5-pointed stars instead of 6-pointed ones, and she proceeded to sew the first American flag. This heartwarming story has just one problem. There is no contemporary evidence that any of it happened. The Betsy Ross story was first made public in 1870, nearly a century after the event supposedly occurred. William Canby, Betsy Ross's grandson, presented a paper to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania describing his grandmother's role in creating the flag. Canby claimed that his grandmother had told him the story when he was a child and that she had mentioned it to other family members as well. Canby's account was based entirely on family oral tradition. He had no documents, no letters, no receipts, no contemporary sources of any kind to support the story. He submitted affidavits from elderly relatives who remembered Betsy Ross mentioning something about a flag, but their recollections were vague and second-hand, memories of memories told decades earlier. At the time Canby presented his paper, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania was skeptical. The story had never appeared in any history of the Revolution or any biography of George Washington. No records from 1776 mentioned Betsy Ross in connection with the flag. The tale seemed unlikely, coming so late with so little evidence. Despite this skepticism from historians, the story captivated the American public. In the 1870s, as the United States approached its centennial celebration in 1876, there was intense interest in Revolutionary War history and heroes. Americans were eager for patriotic stories, especially ones that highlighted women's contributions to the founding of the nation. The Betsy Ross story perfectly filled this need. Artists began depicting the scene of Betsy Ross showing the flag to George Washington and the Congressional Committee. These paintings, though based on no evidence of what such a scene might actually have looked like, became widely reproduced. The most famous image, painted by Charles Weisberger in the 1890s, shows Betsy Ross in her shop with Washington and others admiring her work. This painting fixed the visual image of the story in American consciousness. Betsy Ross's house in Philadelphia became a tourist attraction. Visitors could see where the first flag was supposedly sewn, though the building's connection to Ross was itself questionable. A non-profit organization preserved the house and promoted the story, which became embedded in school curricula and popular histories. So what is the actual history of the American flag's creation? The Continental Congress passed the Flag Resolution on June 14, 1777, over a year after independence was declared. The resolution stated, "Resolved, that the flag of the United States be 13 stripes." A year after independence was declared. The resolution stated, "Resolved, that the flag of the United States be 13 stripes, alternate red and white. That the Union be 13 stars, white in a blue field, representing a new constellation." This resolution is remarkably vague. It does not specify the arrangement of the stars, the dimensions of the flag, the shade of blue or red, or who should make the flags. It does not mention anyone by name as having designed or created the flag. The brevity and vagueness of the resolution suggest it was not considered particularly momentous at the time. Flags bearing stars and stripes had appeared before the official resolution. During the Revolution, various military units and ships used flags with different designs, some incorporating stars, stripes, or both. The design evolved organically, with no single creator. There is no evidence that George Washington was involved in flag design or production in June 1776, as the Betsy Ross story claims. Sex 1.5. Washington was not in Philadelphia that month. He was in New York, preparing to defend the city against the expected British attack. The Continental Congress had not yet declared independence, so there would have been little reason to commission a new flag for a new nation that had not yet been officially proclaimed. The supposed secret committee that visited Betsy Ross cannot be verified. No congressional records mention such a committee or any flag-related business in June 1776. The men identified in various versions of the Betsy Ross story as being on the committee were not, as far as records show, working together on any flag-related project. Betsy Ross was a real person who did sew flags, among other things. She was an upholsterer, a skilled needleworker who made and repaired various fabric items, including flags. Records show that she was paid by the Pennsylvania State Navy Board for making flags in 1777, so she certainly did make flags for the revolutionary cause. She may well have made many flags during the war. What she did not do is create the first American flag in the specific circumstances described in the traditional story. The 5-pointed star detail in the story is interesting. Betsy Ross supposedly demonstrated that 5-pointed stars were easier to make than 6-pointed ones by folding fabric and cutting out a 5-pointed star with a single scissors snip. This is a nice detail that makes the story more vivid and technical. However, there is no evidence this demonstration ever occurred, and 5-pointed stars were not unusual or innovative in 1776. The earliest flags that survive from the Revolutionary period show a variety of star arrangements. Some have stars in a circle, some in rows, some in other patterns. This variety suggests that no standard design existed initially, and that individual flag makers used whatever arrangement they preferred or found convenient. The familiar circular arrangement of stars is associated with the Betsy Ross flag, but this pattern was not universal, even if such a flag existed. So, why did the Betsy Ross story become so popular despite the lack of evidence? Several factors contributed. The story emerged at a time when women's contributions to history were beginning to be recognized and celebrated. The late 19th century saw the rise of women's suffrage movement and increasing attention to women's roles in society. A story about a woman playing a key role in creating a national symbol was appealing. The story was also charmingly domestic. Betsy Ross was portrayed as a humble seamstress, working in her small shop, yet contributing to the birth of a nation. This combined patriotism with domesticity, suggesting that women could be patriotic and important while still operating in traditional feminine spheres. It was an empowering story that did not challenge gender norms too radically. The story provided a human, personal narrative for the creation of an important symbol. Rather than a flag emerging from an impersonal congressional resolution, it came from the skilled hands of a real woman, suggested by the great George Washington himself. This made the flag's creation more relatable and memorable. Historians who have investigated the Betsy Ross story over the past century have generally concluded that while Betsy Ross did sew flags during the Revolutionary period, the specific story of her creating the first American flag is not supported by evidence and is probably false. The Historical Society of Pennsylvania, after more than a century of consideration, has concluded that the story cannot be verified and was likely created, or at least greatly embellished, long after the supposed events. Yet the story persists in popular culture and is still taught to many American schoolchildren. The image of Betsy Ross sewing the flag remains iconic. The house in Philadelphia continues to attract tourists. For many Americans, the story is too deeply embedded to be easily dislodged, even by historians pointing out the lack of evidence. The Betsy Ross story illustrates how national myths can develop around symbols. Flags are powerful symbols of national identity, and people want origin stories for such symbols that are meaningful and memorable. A bureaucratic congressional resolution does not satisfy this desire the way a story about a skilled craftswoman and the first president does. It also shows how family traditions and oral history can be unreliable. William Canby undoubtedly believed the story he heard from his grandmother. But memories fade, details get confused, and people sometimes remember things that did not happen quite the way they think. By the time Canby heard the story, decades had passed, and his grandmother was very elderly. What she actually remembered and what she may have embellished or confused cannot now be determined. As we settle deeper into rest, we might reflect on the interesting fact that one of America's most patriotic stories is almost certainly untrue. The first American flag was probably designed and made by committee and craftspeople whose names are lost to history. Betsy Ross may have been one of many flag makers during the Revolution, but she did not create the first flag in the dramatic circumstances described. The real history of the flag's creation is less neat and less personal than the myth, but perhaps no less interesting. The flag evolved through trial and error, through the work of many hands, through a gradual process of standardization. It was not the creation of any single person, but the product of a collective need to symbolize a new nation. Yet, the myth of Betsy Ross tells us something true about America, even if the specific story is false. It expresses a desire to see the nation's founding as the work of ordinary people, not just famous men. It suggests that crucial contributions can come from unexpected places, from small workshops as well as grand meeting halls. These are values worth celebrating, even if the particular story celebrating them is not historically accurate. Sometimes the stories nations tell about themselves reveal not what actually happened, but what people wish had happened, what they think should have happened, what fits their understanding of who they are. The Betsy Ross story is such a tale, created long after the fact to give a meaningful personal origin to an important national symbol. The flag's true origins may be lost in the confusion of Revolutionary War, but the story of Betsy Ross has become part of the flag's meaning, adding layers of sentiment that facts alone cannot provide. Lady Godiva's Ride, a noblewoman's legendary protest. The story of Lady Godiva riding naked through the streets of Coventry to persuade her husband to lower oppressive taxes has become one of the most famous legends in English history. The beautiful noblewoman, her modesty protected only by her long hair, riding through the town while respectful citizens averted their eyes, has inspired countless artworks and remains a symbol of self-sacrifice for the common good. Yet the famous ride almost certainly never happened. There was a real Lady Godiva, or more properly, Godgifu, an Anglo-Saxon noblewoman who lived in the 11th century. She was married to Leofric, Earl of Mercia, one of the most powerful noblemen in England. Leofric and Godgifu were generous benefactors to religious houses, particularly the monastery at Coventry, which they founded or substantially refounded around 1043. Historical records mention Godgifu as a person of some importance. She witnessed charters alongside her husband, indicating she participated in legal and political affairs. She survived her husband and lived into the 1060s, continuing to control lands and make donations to the church. This much is documented history. The famous story of her naked ride appears nowhere in contemporary sources. The earliest chronicles from the 11th century that mention Godgifu say nothing about any such ride. The first written account of the story appears over a century and a half after Godgifu's death, in the Chronicle of Roger of Wendover, written in the early 13th century, around 1235. According to Roger of Wendover, Lady Godiva repeatedly begged her husband to lower the oppressive taxes he had imposed on the people of Coventry. Leofric, annoyed by her constant pleading, finally said he would abolish the taxes if she would ride naked through the town. To his surprise, Godiva agreed to this humiliating condition. She arranged for all the people of Coventry to stay indoors with their windows shuttered while she made her ride. Then, with her body covered only by her long hair, she rode on horseback through the market of the town. Her husband, impressed by her courage and devotion to the people, kept his word and abolished the taxes. This story, even in its earliest version, has the character of a legend rather than a historical account. It contains stock elements common to many folk tales: the virtuous lady, the cruel or capricious lord, the humiliating challenge, the unexpected fulfillment, and the happy resolution. The detail of her long hair conveniently preserving her modesty is especially characteristic of legend rather than reality. Moreover, the story does not fit what we know about 11th century England and feudal power structures. Taxes were not imposed or removed on the whim of individual noblemen like Leofric. Taxation was a complex matter involving royal authority, customary rights, and various legal obligations. An earl could not simply abolish the taxes on a town because his wife performed a public stunt. The idea that all the townspeople would cooperate by staying indoors and not looking is also implausible. Medieval towns were bustling places, and enforcing such a universal compliance would have been virtually impossible. Someone would have looked, whether out of curiosity, defiance, or simple failure to receive or obey the instruction. Later versions of the legend, developed in the 16th and 17th centuries, added the character of Peeping Tom. According to this edition, all the townspeople honoured Lady Godiva's sacrifice by remaining indoors with their windows covered, except for one man, a tailor named Tom, who drilled a hole in his shutter to watch. For this transgression, he was struck blind, struck dead, or punished in some other way, depending on the version. The Peeping Tom element clearly reflects later morality and concerns. It adds a cautionary tale about the punishment for voyeurism and disrespect, while also acknowledging what most people would assume, that someone probably would try to look. The story became more complex, with layers of meaning about respect, propriety, and divine punishment for transgression. Scholars have noted similarities between the Lady Godiva legend and other European folk tales involving naked rides and challenges. Various cultures have stories of women who undertake humiliating or difficult tasks to save their communities from oppression. The specific motif of a woman riding naked appears in several medieval legends, suggesting it may have been a traditional story element that became attached to the historical. Godiva. The historical Godiva's generosity to Coventry and its monastery may have been the kernel of truth around which the legend formed. She and her husband were known as benefactors of the town. Perhaps this genuine charitable connection to Coventry led to stories celebrating her virtue and devotion to the people, which eventually developed into the dramatic legend of the Naked Ride. The story served various purposes in medieval and later periods. It celebrated female virtue, particularly the willingness to sacrifice personal dignity for others' welfare. It portrayed an ideal of noblewomen as compassionate intermediaries between harsh lords and suffering commoners. It also provided a colourful local legend for Coventry, giving the town a distinctive place in English lore. During the Protestant Reformation and afterward, the story took on additional meanings. Some saw it as an example of an individual standing against unjust authority. The Naked Ride became a symbol of moral courage, stripping away pretense to reveal truth and virtue. Different interpreters found different lessons in the tale, adapting it to their concerns. By the Victorian era, the Lady Godiva legend had become firmly established in popular consciousness. Artists produced numerous paintings and sculptures depicting the scene, though they typically portrayed Godiva more clothed than the story suggests, in deference to Victorian propriety. The poet, Alfred Lord Tennyson, wrote a poem about Godiva that was widely read and helped further popularise the story. Coventry embraced the legend as part of its identity. A procession commemorating Godiva's ride became an annual event in the city. Statues of Lady Godiva were erected. The legend became inseparable from the city's public image, a major tourist attraction and source of civic pride. Modern historians examining the evidence have concluded that the Naked Ride almost certainly never occurred. The late appearance of the story, its folktale characteristics, its implausibility given what we know about medieval society and governance, and the lack of any contemporary documentation all point to it being a later invention. Yet the legend persists because it serves purposes beyond historical accuracy. It provides a dramatic and memorable story about feminine virtue, compassion, and courage. It gives Coventry a distinctive historical identity. It offers a symbol that can be interpreted in various ways depending on contemporary concerns. The story has been used to argue for tax relief, for women's rights, for individual liberty against oppressive authority, and for various other causes. The image of Lady Godiva has been appropriated by advertisers, protesters, and artists. The legend has proven remarkably adaptable, able to take on new meanings in new contexts. while retaining its basic narrative. As we consider Lady Godiva's story, we might reflect on how a historical person can become the framework for a legend that serves cultural needs. The real god Gifu was evidently a wealthy noblewoman who made charitable donations. The legendary Lady Godiva became a symbol of self-sacrifice, moral courage, and compassion for the oppressed. The historical god Gifu might not recognize herself in the legend, but perhaps she would not mind. The story, though false as history, kept her name alive for 1,000 years and associated it with virtue and courage. Many historical figures who actually existed have been completely forgotten, while god Gifu is remembered, even if what is remembered is largely fictional. The legend also reminds us that medieval people were capable of creating and believing colorful stories about their relatively recent past. The Lady Godiva story was being told within a century and a half of the supposed events, yet it was already clearly legendary rather than historical. Myths do not require vast stretches of time to develop. They can emerge surprisingly quickly if they serve a cultural need. The real woman and the legendary woman coexist in history, impossible to fully separate. We know god Gifu existed. We know the naked ride did not occur as described. Yet, the legend has become a historical fact in its own right, a story that has influenced art, literature, politics, and local identity for centuries. Sometimes, the stories told about the past become as historically significant as the past itself. As these stories draw to a close, we are reminded of a profound truth about history and human nature. The past is not simply a collection of facts waiting to be discovered. It is also a canvas upon which each generation paints its own meanings, values, and needs. The figures we have explored tonight, Arthur and Robin Hood, Pope Joan and William Tell, Pythagoras and Betsy Ross, existed at the intersection of history and myth, where what we want to believe often overshadows what actually happened. These legends persist not because of the evidence supporting them, but because of the purposes they serve. They provide heroes we can admire, lessons we can teach, symbols we can rally around, and stories that make complex history comprehensible. Whether any of these tales are true in a literal sense becomes almost secondary to their cultural truth, their ability to express values and ideas that matter to us. As you drift into sleep, perhaps you can reflect on this curious aspect of human consciousness. We are storytelling creatures who need narratives to make sense of the world. We reshape the past to fit present needs, create heroes to embody our ideals, and invent stories that teach the lessons we think important. Understanding this does not diminish the past. Rather, it helps us see history as a living process, continuously reinterpreted by each generation. The historical figures